class, in this video we're going to talk about the heart. Okay, so this is unit 3. Okay, so where is the heart located? It's located in an area known as the mediastinum or mediastinum. So it's found between the lungs, behind the sternum. Okay, so that area, that space there where the heart sits is known as the mediastinum. Okay, and then it's encased within a pericardium. Okay, so you probably saw this when you dissected the pigs in AMP1. The heart had this like thin membrane around it. That's the pericardium. Okay, and it has 2 main layers to it, a visceral and a parietal layer. The visceral layer is directly around the heart, and then the parietal layer is more superficial. Okay, and then in between there you would have serous fluid, okay, to stop any pain from the heart pumping. Okay, so superficially there's a fibrous pericardium made up of dense irregular connective tissue, and then there's that inner serous pericardium. Okay, and then that's the one that has the 2 layers, the visceral, deeper visceral layer, and the superficial parietal layer. Okay, and then that serous cavity between those filled with fluid. Okay, and that's to prevent too much friction. Okay, now the walls of the heart are made up of 3 different layers. Okay, so the most inner layer is the endocardium. So that's the layer surrounding, the actual ventricles. Okay. Then the myocardium is a thick layer. Myo means muscle, so it's a thick muscle layer. And then the very outer layer is the epicardium. Okay, so the epicardium. And that's going to be continuous with the visceral layer. That's basically the visceral layer of the pericardium. Okay, then we have our serous cavity. Then we have our serous layer of the pericardium. Then we have that fibrous layer. Okay, fibrous pericardium. Okay, so we have 4 chambers of the heart. We have 2 upper atria and 2 lower ventricles. Okay, and we're going to talk about blood flow. Okay, so the heart is basically a transport system, and there's 2 side-by-side pumps. So let me draw out some very, very poorly drawn out heart. Okay, so don't judge here. This is my heart. We have our atria, these are the openings here, and our ventricles here. Okay, so this is anatomical. So this would be the anatomical right side of the heart, and this would be the anatomical left side of the heart, right? Okay, so the right side of the heart receives oxygen poor blood from the tissues. So after the blood drops off all the oxygen to the tissues, oxygen poor blood will enter into the right atrium, and then into the right ventricle, and then that sends blood to the lungs to become oxygenated. And so this is known as the pulmonary circuit, pulmonary like lung, so that blood gets sent to the lungs. The left side of the heart receives oxygenated blood from the lungs, okay, and pumps it through the aorta and then to the rest of the body tissues. So the left side of the heart is known as the systemic circuit because it sends blood to the rest of the body systems. Okay. All right. So let's go through blood flow quickly. I do have another video where I go through that, so I'm just going to go through it very quickly here. Make sure you watch that other video and I go into a lot more detail, okay? So we have a superior and an inferior vena cava, and then a coronary sinus. The coronary sinus takes oxygen poor blood from the heart muscle walls itself, okay? Superior vena cava from the top part of the body, inferior vena cava from the trunk and bottom part of the body. Okay, so that all brings the oxygen poor blood into the right atrium. Then we have a valve leading from the right atrium into the left atrium. Okay, and that's known as the tricuspid valve. So blood flows or is pumped into the pumping of the blood opens up this valve, and blood flows into the right ventricle, okay? Then from the right ventricle, blood is pumped up through a pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk, okay? So we have a pulmonary trunk here, and that separates into the right and left pulmonary arteries, okay? Now these are some of the only arteries that contain oxygen-poor blood. Arteries always move away from the heart, arteries A for away, and veins always move back toward the heart, okay? So, but these arteries contain oxygen-poor blood. All the other arteries contain oxygen-rich blood that's gonna be pumped to the rest of the body. So our pulmonary arteries lead to the lungs. So the lungs are gonna be on either side of the heart there. Then from the lungs, blood gets oxygenated, and then leading into the left atrium are the pulmonary veins, okay? So those bring oxygen-rich blood into the left atrium. That squeezes and pushes oxygen-rich blood into the left ventricle. And then from the left ventricle, blood is squeezed through the aortic semilunar valve, okay? And into the aorta, okay? And the aorta has different branches. We'll talk about those more when we get to arteries and veins or blood vessels, okay, in the next unit, okay? And then that sends oxygen-rich blood to all of the body tissues, and blood also gets sent to the heart. The heart itself also needs oxygen, right? So the heart itself, the heart muscle wall also gets oxygenated blood. Okay. Okay. Okay, I'm just skipping over all this because this was all blood flow through the heart. You can look at the PowerPoint. There's lots of slides on blood flow through the heart. Then the PowerPoint goes into coronary circulation. I have a video on that too, so I'm going to skip over that for now. Make sure you watch that other video. Okay. Okay, cardiac muscle tissue. So cardiac muscle tissue has lots of mitochondria, a lot more than in our skeletal muscle tissue, because the heart needs to constantly be pumping, right? It's very important that our body tissues get blood or else the tissues will die, okay? Remember when we talked about tissue histology, our cardiac muscle cells are connected at the intercalated discs. Those are connected via gap junctions, okay? So there's a little bit of space there for things to be able to move through the cell, okay? Conduction system is next, so make sure you watch the video on the conduction system as well, okay? So I'm going to kind of go through all of that. Okay, let's talk about, or actually, yeah, I go through that in the video, I believe. Okay, so the intrinsic conduction system, let's just go through quickly, okay? So the sinoatrial node is where this is like where the electrical signals pass through the heart to help the heart to pump, okay? So we start at the sinoatrial node, okay? So sinoatrial node is like the pacemaker of the heart. It's in the right atrial wall, okay? So it depolarizes faster than the rest of the myocardium, okay? And this creates the sinus rhythm of the heart, okay? So it has a rate of about 100 times per minute, okay? But that's slowed down by some other factors as well, okay? I believe I talked about this in the other video, so I'm just gonna go through this quickly, okay? Then the impulse spreads across the atria and to the atrioventricular node. So it's in the interatrial septum, so the space here between the atria, this would be, so our sinoatrial node somewhere in the right atrium, then it travels to the atrioventricular node in the interatrial septum, okay? So this has a rate of about 50 times per minute if there was no SA node present, okay? Then we have our AV bundle, also known as the bundle of His. So it kind of branches off here, Okay, so this is in the superior part of the interventricular septum, so between the ventricles here. Okay, so this is the only electrical connection between the atria and the ventricles, so it's an important one, right? And then it branches off into these right and left bundle branches, okay? And it carries the impulse toward the apex of the heart, which is at the bottom of the heart, okay? And then into the Purkinje fibers, so these come up and around and they branch off to give electrical signals to all the different parts of the myocardium here of the heart. Okay, so those are the Purkinje fibers there. Okay. It's going to be more elaborate on the left side of the heart. The left myocardium is thicker because it needs to pump a lot harder to push the blood from the left ventricle through the aorta and the rest of the body, right? In our right ventricle, it's just sending blood to the lungs, which are right next to the heart. It doesn't need to push that hard. So the myocardium on the left side of the heart is a lot thicker than on the right side of the heart, okay? Okay, so again, let's just go through this quickly. We start in the sinoatrial node in the right atrium, okay? That sends, that's the pacemaker, makes the pace of the heart rhythm, okay? Then we go to the AV node. This is where that signal pauses very quickly, only for about a millisecond, right? Or a few milliseconds, okay? Then into the AV bundle, and that goes into the left and right bundle branches, and then through the Purkinje fibers, okay? So this helps the muscle cells to contract. This is the electrical signal that tells them to contract. Okay, so how is cardiac muscle similar to skeletal muscle? For both skeletal and cardiac muscle, the contraction is preceded by a depolarizing action potential. So it needs an action potential before a contraction can occur. Okay, the depolarization wave travels down T tubules and causes the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium in both cases. And excitation contraction coupling occurs. Okay, so calcium binds to troponin and causes filaments to slide in heart tissue as well. Okay, differences, some cardiac muscle cells are self-excitable, okay, while skeletal muscle is not self-excitable. Okay, the heart contracts as one unit, whereas skeletal muscle cells contract independently, so we could use some of them and not all of them if we need to use less muscle, for example. Okay, and then the influx of calcium from the extracellular fluid triggers calcium to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay, skeletal muscles do not use extracellular calcium. Remember, it was within the muscle cell itself. Okay. And cardiac muscle fibers have a longer absolute refractory period than skeletal muscle fibers, okay? So that absolute refractory period is almost as long as the contraction itself, okay? And the heart relies almost exclusively on aerobic respiration, whereas muscle cells can use either aerobic or anaerobic, okay? Okay, EKG, so let's talk about an EKG. So an EKG is an electrocardiogram, and it can tell us what is happening electrically in the heart, okay? So let's draw out a typical EKG, okay? So we have our millivolts on the side and time on the bottom. So it's millivolts per second. Millivolts per second. Okay, so we have first, starting at 0, we have then our first P wave, okay, then our QRS complex, okay, we're back to around 0 there, and then we have a T wave, okay, and then a flat line again, and this whole thing just keeps starting over if if everything is normal there. Okay, so during this, so this is P wave, this is Q, R, S, and this is T here. So during our P wave, that's where the SA node, the sinoatrial node, is being depolarized. So the atria are being depolarized. In the QRS complex, the ventricles are being depolarized and the atria are being repolarized. Okay, so they're filling back up with blood, going back to normal. That's what would happen during repolarization. Depolarization is when you're getting that electrical signal. In the T wave, that's ventricular repolarization. So you can't really see the atrial repolarization here because the ventricular depolarization is such a high wave. Okay, but it is happening. Okay, P to R interval is from the beginning of atrial excitation to the beginning of ventricular excitation. And the Q to T interval is the beginning of the ventricular depolarization through ventricular repolarization, so relaxation. Okay. So one cardiac cycle will have the contraction or systole and relaxation or diastole of both of the atria, left and right atria, and then it will be quickly followed by the systole and diastole of the ventricle. So there's a lot of things happening. These electrical events that are shown here. Pressure changes in the heart, of course, right? When it's pumping, there will be higher pressure. Heart sounds, which is the lub-dub that you hear when you're listening with a stethoscope. Okay, and that sound is actually caused by the closure of the valves. Okay, so the lub sound, the first sound that you hear in the heart beating, that's the sound of the tricuspid and bicuspid valves closing, and the dub sound is the sound of the semilunar valves closing, so the pulmonary and the aortic valves closing. Okay, you will also see volume changes in the heart, right, where the atria fill with blood, so you'll increase volume there, and then you'll decrease volume in the atria and increase volume in the ventricles when they fill with blood. And there's mechanical events involved as well. Okay, so let's go quickly through all of those events. Okay. So from our P to R, that's going to be our atrial systole. Okay, so contraction of the atria is going to happen here. And then from R to T here, that's going to be our ventricular systole. And then here we would have our relaxation period until our next P wave occurs again. Okay, pressure, so our pressure is going to increase a lot during ventricular systole, right? We have a lot of pressure trying to push that blood out of the ventricles. Okay, so that's where you'll see the highest pressure increase there. Okay, and then volume, okay, is going to increase a lot when the atria drain into the ventricles, so during atrial systole. Okay, so first phases of the cardiac cycle, we have our atria compressing, right, or contracting and pushing blood into the ventricles. Then we have our volume increasing in the ventricles. Then the ventricles are going to eject, so they're going to squeeze blood into those semilunar valves. Okay, so that's where that pressure greatly increases. Okay, and then isovolumetric relaxation, so the ventricles relax and blood starts to fill into the atria again. Okay, and then that just continues. Atrial contraction, ventricular filling, ventricular contraction, ventricular relaxation while the atria fill with blood. And those are the just basic steps that happen during any heart rhythm, okay, heart contraction.